because it seems that we have very different definitions of it, and yours seem to be kind of one-dimensional and simplistic, which makes your arguments agreeable, yes, on the surface, but not, agreeable on the surface, yes, but not really anything more than basic.
Okay. Well, since you're already critiquing them, why don't you give me your definition? We can discuss that. That seems more productive.
No, actually I just want to hear yours because that's how your whole, I want to know what your argument is based upon, and your definitions are what matters here, not mine, so please continue.
Okay, so I'll give mine and then we can trade if you want, and we can have a full discussion. It'll be awesome. So my definition of white privilege is that America was founded on racism, and that it is inherent in the Constitution of the United States and our legal system, and it is unremovable from the United States and our legal system. It is bound up in our economics, it's bound up in our intellectual system, it's bound up in all of the institutions that surround us. And therefore, individual failings are largely due, or group failings, if there's disparity between groups, group failings are due to these institutional biases that long predated the people who are born today, as opposed to the fault or responsibility of the individual today. Do you find that deeply wrong or unfair?
I think that's very one-dimensional, but can you please go on to microaggression? No, I'm just curious. I don't want to.
Sure. You can label it whatever you want. I was hoping to get your definition also, so we can actually come to consensus if we could. I mean, that'd be more interesting to me. But if you want me just to define things, okay, dictionary time. Okay, So microaggressions, according to Jonathan Haidt and Greg Lukianoff in The Atlantic, are largely defined as implicit statements that we make that offend other people without even knowing it. And they're based subjectively. They're not based objectively. So I can say something to you, like if I ask you where you're from, right? You can take that as a microaggression, particularly if you're from a foreign country, because you may be thinking that I'm thinking that you are a foreigner, for example. And to me, subjectivity in interpretation is significantly less important or decent for a society in which we actually have to talk to each other than objective meanings of words and statements.
Personally, I do agree with that definition to an extent. The comment that you made about having microaggressions allow someone to put their hands on them or allow someone to act negatively or aggressively or physically, I do disagree with that because I think that's taking a jump away from what microaggressions actually mean.
So then what call them microaggressions? So instead, why don't you just say, that offends me?
And which is perfectly fine, but I think that what microaggressions mean, you are taking it another step outside of what the common definition is, or at least the definition that I may use. I just think that we're
you're right that I'm extending the logic to what campuses actually do, namely punish people for microaggressions or take measures against them. So you may agree that something's a microaggression, there shouldn't be measures against it. I'm suggesting that we come to an agreement now, you and I, that the language of microaggressions ought to go away, and instead we'll just call them subjectively offensive statements, because that's more accurate. Microaggression implies there's something objectively aggressive about what I am saying to you if I say something to you that you don't like.
Well, I don't want to take too much time.
It's interesting, so I'm glad you're here.
I will step by that one because I just for now. Next one is trigger warnings.
Okay, so trigger warnings are again based on the idea that I'm going to say something to you that is. Were you here? Yes.
Definition of it because I think we have two different definitions of what all these terms.
The reason that I'm finding this conversation mildly unproductive is you're not giving me your definition, so we can actually reach something here. Again, I'm happy to define things until the cows come home. But what I enjoy doing is actually figuring out, if you think I'm wrong, you tell me where I'm wrong, and then we can discuss where I'm wrong or not. That seems more productive to me. Wouldn't it be more productive to you? I mean, as opposed to me just saying?
Okay, so it would be more productive, but this is a lot. Oh, it's a lot more people when I want to speak.
We have a long line.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
So thank you.
Again, folks, if you want to email me, if you want to email, my email address, if you want to have these discussions in more length, is bshapiro@dailywire.com. I'm always happy to have long conversations as time permits to do these things.
Thank you.
Unconscious bias is a concept well documented in psychological studies, which is basically that people associate negative things with people of color and positive things with whites. So if that is true, given that that is true, how does white privilege not exist?
Okay, so you're asking about unconscious bias. I apologize because it's kind of echoey. But the question was, if there is unconscious bias, just to repeat it so I'm making sure I get it right. If there is unconscious bias, how does white privilege not exist?
The question is, given that there is unconscious bias, how does white privilege not exist?
So number one, so when I speak about white privilege, yes, so when I speak about white privilege, I'm speaking specifically about behavior. Okay, there have been no studies, and really I've looked at these studies, the connection between what they call implicit bias, this is their favorite phrase now, implicit bias, unconscious bias, and biased behavior has yet to be proven at any level that is even remotely necessary to be used in, for example, a courtroom, which is why it's never been used in a courtroom. It is also true that there is no way, there really isn't, there's been no proven way to alleviate what they call unconscious bias, which means that we're ghost hunting. So what I would suggest is that if there is unconscious bias, and I'll acknowledge the possibility or the reality of unconscious bias, if there is, then I need you to I don't care about what's in people's heads so much as what they do. So if you point me to a racist behavior, don't worry, I'll let you respond. If you point me to a racist behavior, I'm happy to stand alongside you and protest it. What I can't do is protest about things in people's head that I don't know about because I'm not a mind reader.
Okay, so that's a really interesting response, and to that I have two questions. Firstly, what I've heard you say that this is something that, the way people think doesn't affect their behavior. So that's the first thing you've said. So I'm really curious if you can kind of give me another example of a thought that somebody has which doesn't affect their behavior. Like, do people who, support Trump not vote for him? Like, I'm very curious about that.
Yes.
And secondly, so the second thing that I want to ask is that if it's something it's hard to fix, does it mean we shouldn't do anything about it? Because you said, I don't know if we can change how people think. Does that mean we shouldn't try?
I mean, first of all, not a great impression. But beyond that, my voice isn't that low. But beyond that, as far as the first question, which is, do people have thoughts that don't manifest in behavior? Yes, all the time.
For instance?
For instance, every thought that you have about walking up here and strangling me right now. I assume like we have thoughts all the time that don't manifest in behavior, and this is true every single day. We consider thoughts that cross our minds. The problem with unconscious bias is the idea is you don't even know that you're having the thought, right? So how can you stop it if you don't even know that you're having it? But then we should be able to gauge the unconscious bias and its impact on behavior. That's why it's unconscious bias as opposed to conscious bias. The idea behind unconscious bias is that it's not even a ghost, it's a ghost of a ghost, because you don't even know you're having the thought. So people, the whole idea behind diversity training is the idea that you can retrain people to stop their chain of thoughts in order so that it doesn't manifest in behavior. I don't think that every thought manifests in behavior. If it did, then every time a man saw a good-looking woman walk down the street, a straight man saw a good-looking woman down the street, we'd have a real mess on our hands. So the second question, the idea was a little too broad for me to respond to, which is, just because something is tough, don't we have to face up to it? Yes, we have to face up to tough things all the time. And one of the tough things I would suggest that we face up to is that you have a lot more control over your own behavior and the decisions you make than the supposedly widespread unconscious bias of people you've never met. So first of all, let's start with the notion of white privilege, which has become this buzzword that you hear all the time now. White privilege is responsible for everything up to and including the Kardashians. It's responsible for everything, white privilege. White privilege is a way to silence anybody who is not of color. That's what white privilege is. It is just a leftist bullshit term that means shut up because you are not a member of a minority group, a privileged minority group in the leftist space. It's reverse racism of the highest order. You're basically saying to white people who aren't racist, and you can't find any proof of their racism, that they must be racist because they're white. That is called racism. If you are accusing somebody of something simply because of the color of their skin without any evidence, that's called racism, gang. But you don't have to trust me. Let's go through what other people say the definition of white privilege is. Folks on the left, what do they say that white privilege is? Well, here's the definition of white privilege from the Southern Poverty Law Center. There's a book that I'm sure was just a massive bestseller in its day called White Anti-Racist Activism, A Personal Roadmap. And the only person who bought it was the author, Jennifer Holliday's mother. But apparently, her mother works for the Southern Poverty Law Center, because here is the definition of white privilege that they quote over at the SPLC. For people who don't know, the SPLC is an extraordinarily far-left organization that pushes the notion that basically anybody who is conservative and on the right side of the aisle must be a member of a hate group. So here is their definition of white privilege. Quote, white skin privilege is not something that white people necessarily do, create, or enjoy on purpose. Unlike the more overt individual and institutional manifestations of racism, White skin privilege is a transparent preference for whiteness that saturates our society. White skin privilege serves several functions. First, it provides white people with perks that we do not earn and that people of color do not enjoy. Second, it creates real advantages for us. White people are immune to a lot of challenges. And finally, white privilege shapes the world in which we live, the way we navigate and interact with one another and with the world. Okay, when my daughter spits up, she's 22 months old. When she spits up, it sounds like this. So let's talk about the perks. Let's talk about the perks that white privilege supposedly confers upon you. So she says, the author here, she says that perks that are conferred upon you by white privilege include things like when you go to the grocery store and you get a Band-Aid, the Band-Aid is your skin tone. Seriously, is what she says. Right? For those who live in the real world, this is also called the free market, because most of the people in the country happen to have a lighter shade of skin, and if you want to sell more Band-Aids, then you are going to market to the group of people who buy more Band-Aids. But no, this is white skin privilege. Another example she uses is she says that if you go to a hotel, that the hotel shampoo works better with your hair if you're white than if you're black. I don't know how she scientifically tested this, but in any case, this is, again, if this is as far as white skin privilege goes, I can tell you nobody should use hotel shampoo because it's gross. And then she talks about the real advantages that are conferred upon you by white skin privileges. So what are those advantages? And this is where we really get to the meat of the matter. She says those advantages include skin color, quote, not working against me in terms of how people perceive my financial responsibility, style of dress, public speaking skills, or job performance, as well as people not assuming I got where I am professionally because of my race, and store security personnel or law enforcement officers do not harass me, pull me over, or follow me because of my race. So this is the argument, that America is a deeply racist country that is imbued with this white skin privilege, and that if you are black, you can never overcome this white skin privilege because you live in a deeply racist system that has been created by Western civilization, a Western civilization founded on racism, sexism, and bigotry. So, before I want to go through all of these specifics, because I think it's important for people to actually assess whether these things are true in the United States at current. And I don't care about, let me put one thing first. I don't care about your feelings. Like, just be perfectly clear, I care nothing about your feelings. I don't want to hear about your feelings. I don't want to hear about your subjective emotions. I don't want to hear about your heart cries out to the, I don't care, you're not my wife, you're not my kid, I don't give a damn. Okay, so that being the case, let's actually talk about what is provable and what is not provable, and what accusations have been leveraged and which ones are actually supportable. Okay, first of all, statistical disparity does not necessarily mean discrimination. This is the first thing you need to know. Okay, anybody who's ever been in a statistics class knows that this is true. Right, if they still teach statistics and it's not too much of a microaggression. So statistical disparity does not always mean discrimination. Right, the vast majority of people who play in the NBA are black. Very few of them are 5'9" Jews. Right? That is not because there is some sort of anti-Semitic conspiracy to keep 5'9" Jews out of the National Basketball Association. I mean, I can't complain that I don't play for the Los Angeles Lakers, right? This is because the reality is that in America, it tends to be, just as a general principle, meritocracy rules. That's true from the NBA to the halls of academia, and it is certainly true on college campuses. Okay, so let's go through some of the accusations that have been made about white skin privilege. So financial responsibility, right? So this particular author, she said that one of the things that works against you if you're black in the United States is how people perceive your financial responsibility. Okay, first thing to say here, capitalism is colorblind. The only color that capitalism cares about is green. Okay, capitalism seriously doesn't care about your color, it doesn't care about your race, it doesn't care about your sexuality. In fact, capitalism is the single best way to overcome racism and sexism and bigotry and homophobia, because if you decide to be any of these things, if you decide to be a racist, sexist, bigot, homophobe, the guy next door will not, and he will take all of that money from you. You will be outcompeted. This is the beautiful thing about capitalism. Your advantage in the marketplace is catering to as many clients as possible and to hiring the best people possible. But the usual statistics that are thrown out are statistics about, for example, lenders systematically discriminating against qualified black borrowers. The truth is that if banks routinely did this, they would go bankrupt, of course, because there would be other banks that came in and spend money on black borrowers, and those people would pay back their loans, and these banks would be able to make a mint off of all of this. In fact, it turns out that according to a University of Iowa sociologist named Sarah Harkness, she did a study just last year, it turns out that lenders actually discriminate against black males and white women for some reason. Or they don't discriminate at all, right? Because her statistical size was not big enough. But what she came up with was that black women were lent to at the same rate as white men in her experiments, which just doesn't make any sense. So you have to start thinking, is this something that we ought to take seriously or something that we ought to take with a grain of salt? But I will tell you one area in which there was discrimination, and that is the widespread perception that black people were not getting loans led the federal government to create a subprime lending program specifically designated to get people of minority ethnic status into homes they could not afford with bad credit. Okay, if it had all been lending discrimination, you would have assumed that Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac would have been fine. There would have never been a subprime mortgage crisis. In 1995, President Clinton's Housing and Urban Development Department agreed to let Fannie and Freddie get affordable housing credit for buying subprime securities, particularly with regard to low-income borrowers. So white privilege in the United States extends to the fact that if you are not a member of the white privileged class, you have a better shot of getting a subsidized loan from the federal government. And by the way, there are laws on the books in the United States that if you can prove discrimination in lending, you can sue the hell out of these banks. And in fact, banks have had to settle based on historic discrimination. Nothing I'm saying here says discrimination has never existed in America's history. That would be stupid and afactual. But to suggest that it is a continuing factor in American life that is putting people under the boot of the white establishment is just factually nonsense. A style of dress. We talk about white privilege with regard to style of dress. Okay, seriously, this is nonsense. If there is no white privilege with regard to style of dress. Because here's the reality. If you sag your pants and somebody says to you, pull up your pants, and you're a white guy, nobody says a word. If you sag your pants and you're black and somebody says to you, pull up your pants, you will be called a racist. Right? This has actually happened. David Stern, if you remember, who was the head of the NBA, it was implied and actually said in many cases that he was racist for suggesting that people in the NBA ought to dress in nice suits. It turned out that everybody eventually took him up on that, and now NBA players are the best dressed people on planet Earth. But the fact is that style of dress is not an aspect of white privilege. Public speaking skills. They say, well, when it comes to public speaking skills, then white people have an advantage. President Obama is not nearly as articulate as the press would have you believe. Okay, President Obama is not more articulate than John Edwards was, but according to the media, he was the most articulate man who ever lived. He made Jesus look like a piker. President Obama was the greatest speaker in the history of the world. And part of that was because the media gave him affirmative action points. They did. Because if anybody said the sort of inarticulate things that President Obama has said routinely when he's off teleprompter, they'd be raked over the coals for it. Job performance, right? They say there's discrimination in job performance, and this is white privilege. Right? The fact is that Mizzou has affirmative action in its hiring processes. There are already laws on the books that bar discrimination based on race in hiring. There's already a federal Equal Employment Opportunity Commission that investigates charges of racism on a routine basis. It has a program. It's called E-Race, Eradicating Racism and Colorism in Employment. It's designed to fight discrimination against people of color. That is not white privilege. That is the government going out of its way to attempt to fight individual racists and